Hi everybody, welcome to Starnberg Fellowship's worship service. We're here coming from downtown Munich in the center city, and as you can see, there's not a great flurry of activity going on here, so you have to kind of use your imagination and envision 500 or 600 people walking around us at the same time. Will Powell is our speaker for today, and we're looking forward to hearing the message God has brought to him and to us through him. If you have any special prayer requests, please let us know. You can contact us, and I can guarantee someone will be praying for you. We're regathering soon, I hope. We'll let you know, we'll update what's going on with the possibilities of getting back to our regular worship service. But we will worship God wherever we are and whatever the circumstances. Let us worship God together.
Kids. Well, here's Herbert and here's Sharon, and we're here today to tell you the story about the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. And if you're not sure what a miracle is, then listen carefully, because by the end of this story you will know. The story is amazing. Here we go. This story is about a miracle. If you don't know what a miracle is, you will know by the end of this story. Just remember, only God can do miracles, and he still does them today. Jesus had sent the 12 disciples out into the country and gave them the power to heal sick people and tell the others about God's love. When the disciples returned, they met with Jesus to tell him about all they met, all the people they met, and all the adventures they'd had, and all the people they had healed. They were really excited to tell Jesus. The problem was, people followed the disciples so they could find Jesus. They'd seen the miracles he'd done, and of course they wanted to see more. But Jesus knew the disciples wanted to talk to him by himself. They hadn't had a chance to eat yet, and they were tired. So he said to them, "Come with me, and we'll find a quiet place to talk, and a quiet place where you can get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a quiet place. But many people saw them leaving and recognized them and ran after them on land. The boat Jesus and the disciples were in was slowed down because of the wind, so the people actually got to the other side of the shore before them. When Jesus and the disciples arrived, they noticed a huge crowd. Jesus felt love for these people because he knew they needed a teacher and someone to believe in. He knew that the disciples would understand, so he began teaching to the large crowd in front of him. It was starting to get late, and none of the people had eaten yet. The disciples came to Jesus and said, "There's no food around here and it's getting late. Maybe we should send the people away so they can go to the surrounding towns and get themselves something to eat." But Jesus replied, "Listen, disciples, you give them something to eat." The disciples didn't think that they understood Jesus quite right and said, "We can't feed all these people. There's too many of them. We'd have to work for a whole year to be able to afford to feed all these people." While the disciples were talking to Jesus, one of the disciples named Andrew noticed a small boy walking with a tiny little lunch. He stopped the boy and asked him what he had. He quickly ran over to where the disciples were talking to Jesus and said, "Hey, here's a little boy with 5 small loaves of bread and 2 small fish. How far will that go amongst the people here, Jesus?" Jesus smiled and said, "Tell everyone here to sit down and they will be fed." There was lots of grass to sit on, so everyone was seated, all 5,000 of them. After everyone was seated, Jesus took the loaves of bread and thanked God for them. Then the disciples passed the bread around, and everyone could take as much bread as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. Remember, there were 5 small loaves of bread and 2 small fish. It was only enough for one little boy to eat, and there were 5,000 people all eating from this little boy's lunch, and they could eat as much as they wanted and for as long as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus asked the disciples to gather all the food that was left over so nothing would be wasted. After they gathered all the baskets of food, they counted them up. Can you believe that there were 12 baskets still full of some fish and bread from the little boy's small lunch? His small lunch probably barely filled one of the baskets before Jesus had touched it. And that is the miracle. After the people realized what happened, they said to each other, "This must be an important person sent from God." Well, you know and I know that he was much more than that. So remember, you can't perform miracles, but God can. So if you find yourself in a difficult situation or an impossible situation, just like the people did, the hungry people did in this story, and the disciples who had to feed the people, why don't you, if you find yourself in a difficult situation, why don't you pray to God, and he may perform a miracle for you, because he can. Have a great day, kids. Bye.
I don't know about you, but these spring days where so much is just bursting forth to life gives us so much joy, so much strength, despite our current situations that we have to cope with. I hope you've been taking strength from what nature is doing all around us, taking a bud like this one and making it burst forth into something that's just amazing. The sea of blue, the bluebells and the tulips have given me a huge amount of joy.
Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." But he replied, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." Jesus answered, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me." Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." Then, seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." "Man, I'm not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly.
A cornerstone is the first stone set in the construction of a foundation. All other stones are set in reference to this stone. It determines the position of the entire structure. Please join us at home singing Cornerstone.
My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest fame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Saviour's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Saviour's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, trust in His righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne.
I hope you are enjoying the spring days, fast turning into summer, and seeing everything being made new around us. New leaves, new flowers, new growth everywhere. I'm going to come back to the theme of renewal later at the end of this talk. I also don't know how you've been managing with lockdown. One of the things that our kids wanted to do was to see films, so I weakened and we succumbed to a subscription of Netflix. One of the first films that we've seen is, at least most of, a film called Kingsman, The Secret Service. It's about a character called Eggsy, a typical dropout who eventually hits absolute rock bottom after stealing a car. Eventually he phones a number on the back of a medal his mother was given after his father died. He's released from prison and meets someone called Harry Hart. Harry, in turn, had been saved by Eggsy's father years before. And Kingsman turns out to be a kind of secret service set up by the British elite who lost their heirs in World War I. Now Harry, because he knew Eggsy's father, believes in Eggsy, and the story starts for Eggsy to train as a Kingsman also. I'll not bore you with all the film's details, but I will come back to it later. Some details are a bit gory too, so I'm not sure if I would completely recommend it as a film. But you can skip over those bits with Netflix, as Dominic did for us. Let's look together at Luke 22. First, I want to remind you about Jesus' relationships with his disciples. He spent 3 years with them in ministry, spreading this message of repentance before coming to this, the last week of his life. Jesus has clearly prepared this last evening with his disciples meticulously. He's used other relationships he's forged to prepare the Passover meal. And Luke lets on that Jesus has eagerly desired to eat this Passover with his disciples before I suffer, verse 15. We catch a glimpse of the intimacy God seeks with us by looking at Jesus' desire to spend that last evening with his own disciples. In this intimate atmosphere, then, Jesus institutes for what us now becomes communion. But first, Jesus reveals that he will be betrayed. And then a dispute arises among the different disciples. They were jostling for position. They wanted to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus corrects their ambition and their pride. Who is sitting at the table with them? Is it someone who lords it over them, or is it someone who serves, Jesus asks. And so Jesus sets this example as the ruler of a new kingdom, a king who serves. Interesting, in this passage we also see a rare compliment from Jesus. You are those who have stood by me in my trials. Jesus is explaining the reason they have an inheritance in his kingdom. They have remained faithful to him until this last evening. And in this relationship, Jesus now turns to Peter. He knows him well, his ambitions and his hopes for the future. But he also knows his weaknesses. He looks at him and says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Jesus reveals something of the spiritual battle for Peter. And Jesus has put the weight of his prayers behind Peter. Don't forget that phrase, that your faith may not fail. Given Peter's response, he was confident, perhaps overconfident, that he would not leave Jesus. But Jesus then corrects him again, showing that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crows. So in this section on relationships, what can we take away from this passage? First of all, the kingdom is promised to the faithful. The second is your position in that kingdom should be defined by Jesus' example as the servant king. Even though our position in the kingdom is assured, it is promised because we will remain faithful, Jesus does know how weak our faith is. And he does pray for us in that weakness. I've talked about Jesus' relationships with his disciples, and I want to talk a bit about redemption. As Jesus is arrested, Luke records these chaotic scenes for us. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss, sealing his intention to force Jesus out into the open. Peter, as we learn from John's Gospel, is the one to strike the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. But Jesus, seeing the violence quickly erupting around him, calms the situation. He counters this menacing attitude of those trying to arrest him by explaining they could have taken him any time in the temple courts. But their preference is to do things at night, under the cover of darkness and in secret. Despite Peter's brash reaction during Jesus' arrest, he knows he can't really start a fight, and he knows that that's not Jesus' way. He has listened to what Jesus has said. It's not Jesus' plan. And Peter doesn't give up. He does follow him. He follows Jesus to where he is going to be tried. But sure enough, in that situation where Peter is put to the test, he is confronted and he does disown Jesus 3 times, exactly as Jesus said he would. So what about that prayer that Jesus prayed? Did it fail? Did Peter's faith fail because he denied his Lord? I'm not sure, but I think Luke is trying to help us understand that even when we do something as awful as denying we know our Lord, and however serious that is, it doesn't mean that our faith has completely failed, even though we feel like a complete failure. No, Jesus' prayer prevails. Our faith is able to continue even in situations like that. Now, Peter didn't want to hear Jesus' predictions. He didn't want to hear about Jesus' suffering. He wanted to avoid that and tried to take steps to avoid it during Jesus' arrest. Peter didn't like Jesus' prediction that he would deny Jesus either. And maybe he thought staying physically close to him would help him to be close in faith with him, to show his faith. But in that courtyard, the reckoning came from those who recognized that he was a Galilean. When he realized what he'd done, denying his Lord, the very one he was still trying to follow, he was broken. And Peter's reaction, weeping bitterly, shows just how strong Jesus' prayer for him really is. This reaction is the first step towards Peter's redemption. So how does Peter differ from Judas? Neither of them liked the way Jesus' rhetoric was going. They wanted to change the outcome. They wanted to change Jesus' course, but neither could. The massive difference between them, I think, is their acceptance or lack of acceptance of Jesus' way, and the faith, or their lack of faith, that if Jesus says this is the way, then it must be the right way. So what can we take away from Peter and maybe Judas from this episode? Firstly, sometimes we do know what is going on. We know perhaps a little bit what might happen or what will happen, and we don't like it. And we try to change it. Sometimes that can be the right reaction, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we need to accept Jesus' way. Second, our reaction to failure is the key for our future. The relationship Jesus and Peter had showed that Peter's faith is stronger than his moment of failure. Lastly, our faith is demonstrated by our actions, even if our words are sometimes inconsistent. Peter showed that he wanted to follow Jesus. He kept with him. But then he couldn't pull through. He couldn't admit in that moment that he really belonged to Jesus as Jesus was being tried. The final one of our R's, we've had relationship and redemption, now renewal. In Luke's Gospel we see Peter is the second after Mary Magdalene, Joanna, to run to the tomb on Easter morning. He wonders what has happened. His faith is perhaps maybe a little greater than some of the other apostles who didn't really understand what the women were saying. In Luke's Gospel, we don't actually hear much of Peter again. But in John's Gospel, we know that Jesus comes back to Peter. Peter had returned to be a fisherman, and after Jesus' death. And it was a miraculous catch of fish that Peter again ran, not to the tomb this time, but to Jesus, to have breakfast with him and share the fish. Jesus uses that opportunity to reinstate Peter for each denial, absolutely consistently with the prayer Luke records for us, giving him this task to encourage the church. Peter's path to renewal lies not only in Jesus' prayer, it lies in his ability to face his worst moments. Peter's fear of failure must have remained with him for the rest of his life. But his assurance of acceptance by Jesus will have also remained with him. Now, if you have watched the film Kingsman, you'll remember Eggsy has a kind of redemption experience. He's plucked out of prison by Harry, as I mentioned, and Harry is perhaps the first person in Eggsy's life who really believes in him and gives him perspective. But as you can probably remember, Eggsy fails. He couldn't bring himself to shoot the dog, which had accompanied him during his training. However, when Harry is shot dead, there's a moment where Eggsy needs to decide what he's going to do. Does he not care about Harry? What should he do? The film follows a kind of salvation, uncovering a betrayal that Harry's boss, Arthur, has succumbed to. Arthur hopes to save his own skin, submitting to the evil plans of Valentine. Of course, it's a film, so Eggsy wins the day and brings down Valentine, who had planned to kill all on Earth except a small elite. Now, I don't want to suggest that Arthur is some kind of Judas, or that Eggsy is some kind of Peter, nor that Harry is some kind of Jesus. But there are some parallels in that story. And it's no surprise that we are attracted to the story. It's a kind of archetype of salvation, a mystery which I think only God can explain to us why we're so attracted by these salvation stories. It is part of God's salvation plan. I don't think any follow-on film can work as well. I think the different characters will become confused as the human nature of those characters becomes clear. Maybe we'll watch the sequel one day. But what are the messages for us about Peter's renewal? Here are the takeaways. Jesus, being with us in our moments of failure, brings us strength for our future tasks. Finally, just as I conclude, it's good to call to mind where God took Peter on his journey in the end. Peter went on to become the rock of the church, just as Jesus had predicted he would be, with Jesus as its cornerstone. Jesus knew Peter could become a leader, and he knew that Peter needed to learn to cope with failure. He knew that Peter needed to rely on Jesus. Peter may have had the ambition to become the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, but he needed to learn to serve all. Maybe we can remember that phrase, über den eigenen Schatten springen. And that's only possible with God's help. Peter's only ready for leadership when he's gone through failure, and when he's gone through his reinstatement. I don't know if you need to learn to jump over your own shadow. I know I do, and I know I can't do it on my own. We all struggle with this calling to leadership. We each have a different role in the different realms where God has put us. Each of us needs to show and point the way to the way Jesus wants us to live. Sometimes we want to try and build our own empire, or to just take control. But Jesus is there reminding us, this is my way, and we have to serve. Perhaps we've gone through times of feeling like a failure. Or perhaps we feel like we completely failed. But Jesus is right there with us, praying for us and giving us strength for the next task ahead. God bless.